This is very interesting because actually I give loads of talks. I feel really nervous. It must be because it's an alien environment. I'm a Buddhafield virgin, so you have to be a virgin in some ways, don't you? Okay, I'll do my best. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. That's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. Not just for some, but for everyone. Thank you. Thank you. I won't go into the rest of it. You can relax, that's the singing over. Although actually there was another song that came to my mind when I was thinking about it, which was an old John Lennon one. Love is the answer. Okay, so that's just giving you a little hint of where the talk might take us. So I want to tell you a story, read you a little bit from a book which was very, very important to me as a child. So when I was 10 or 11, I won a school prize and I was given this book, A Wrinkle in Time. So some of you might have seen the movie that came out the end of last year or the beginning of this year. It's quite good. I recommend it if you haven't seen it. But the book is 100 million times better, as is so often the case. Anyway, the story of this is it's a little boy who is quite special, called Charles Wallace, and he's in a family. He's got a big sister called Meg. And without getting into all the detail, it's kind of space and time travel. So it was probably the first sci-fi book I ever read, and it marked me quite strongly. And this little boy, Charles Wallace, gets kind of taken into a very dark place in a very dark world, and his sister and another few people go trying to rescue him, and they find that he's under the influence of something called it, which in the book is much more creepy than it is in the film. It's basically a huge brain that's pulsating, and everybody in this world that this brain is in charge of is pulsating to exactly the same rhythm. It's a bit like the Midwich, not the Midwich Cuckoos, the Stepford Wives. You know, everybody looks the same and they're doing the same thing. The children all come out and they do the same thing with their boat, and then they all go back in for their dinner. Anyway, he's been taken under the influence of this brain called it. And his sister and various others try to rescue him, and basically what's happening is that they're all getting pulled into this dark world as well. They kind of escape, but he's left behind, so somebody has to go back to get him. So after quite a kind of reasoning, Meg decides to go back. Okay, she doesn't want to go back, but she's the only one that can do it. So before she's going, there's these fabulous characters called Mrs. Who, Mrs. Which, and Mrs. What's It. And it is a children's book. Anyway, they give her gifts to take in where that will give her strength in this rescue operation. And I'm just going to read a little bit from that. So she's given, one of them says to her, you've got my love. This one of the figures says, I love you, and that's what you can take in with you. The other one does a whole thing about God that we won't bother with in this particular, a God of his own understanding, it says somewhere. And then the final one says, remember that you have something that it has not got, and that is your only weapon, but you must find it for yourself. Okay? So she goes in, she gets drawn back in, she's trying to get her little brother out of the power of this it. And she says, it isn't used to being resisted. Father said that's how he managed, and how Calvin and I managed as long as we did. But there's nobody here to save me. I have to do this by myself. I have to resist it by myself. So what have I got that it hasn't got? Is it resistance? No, I'm sure it can resist. It just isn't used to other people resisting. She carries on walking until she comes into the room where her little brother's there, sitting in a kind of hunched state beside this brain that's palpating. I was really sorry they missed that bit out of the movie. I was really looking forward to that bit. Anyway, so she realises she's quite scared, and she thinks, is that something? Maybe that's something it hasn't got, fear. She thinks, well, it hasn't got fear, but it can inculcate fear, so that's probably not what it is. And then she's almost lost in this. She's getting really, really dragged in. Says, there was the brain, there was it lying pulsing and quivering, soft, exposed and nauseating. Charles Wallace was crouched beside it, his eyes twiddling, his jaw slack, a tick in his forehead reiterating the revolting rhythm of it. So when she sees her little brother, basically she just gets really, really angry. She feels furious. And then she realises that isn't something that it hasn't got. It's definitely got anger and hatred. And then she says, with the last vestige of her consciousness, she jerked her mind and body away from it. Hate was nothing it didn't have. It knows all about hate. You're lying, she shouts at it. You're lying about Mrs. Watson. Charles Wallace says, Mrs. Watson hates you, and that was where it made its fatal mistake. For automatically Meg responded, no, Mrs. Watson loves me. She told me she loves me, and in that moment she knew what she had that it didn't have. Love. That was what she had. She'd Mrs. Watson's love, and her father's and her mother's and Charles Wallace's and the twins and her aunties, and she had her love for all of them. But how could she use this? If she could give love to it, maybe it would shrivel up and die. But in her weakness and foolishness, she was incapable of loving it. It was too much, but she could love Charles Wallace. She could just stand there and she could just love Charles Wallace, her very own, the child for whom she'd come back to rescue, the baby who was so much more and who was yet so utterly vulnerable. Charles, I love you. My baby brother, I love you. Come back. I love you so much. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was unaware of them. I love you. You're my darling, my dear, the light of my life. Slowly his mouth closed. Slowly his eyes stopped twiddling. The tick in his forehead ceased its revolting twitch. He advanced towards her. I love you, Charles, I love you. And suddenly he was running, he was pelting, he was in her arms, he was shrieking with sobs. I love you too. Thank you. It's a great story. I could finish there actually, but there's a while to go and I've got a ton more notes, so come to it. Anyway, many, I read that when I was 11 or something, and it impacted in me so strongly. It kind of just felt like it was the message that I really needed to hear. You know, I'd had all sorts of difficulties in my own background, and I knew anger, aggression and hatred quite well, even at 10 or 11. But there was something about this message of love that really impacted. Many years later, having discovered Buddhism, I came across the Dhammapada, which I'm sure many of you will know. And in the Dhammapada it says, hatred never ceases through hatred in this world. Through love alone does it cease. This is the eternal law. So in a way that's been a very central message for my Buddhist practice over the last 40 years. So this talk is called Facing the Demons. It's actually got a sub-clause, which is Dharma for troubled times. Because I feel we are living in troubled times. The title of Facing the Demons comes from a talk given by Sangharakshita, my own teacher and founder of Triratna. And he gave a talk in 1979. I was there, I heard this talk in the London Buddhist Centre. And he talks in that, he says, he's talking about the city. He's been driven through the city of London. He says, I mean with a capital C, where the stock exchanges and the banks are. As we drove through, I looked from side to side, skyscraper to the right, skyscrapers to the left, banks to the left, banks to the right. These big ponderous buildings connected with money, high finance, power, because money is power. And I said to my friend who was driving, referring to our new movement, the FWBO, this is what we're up against. These are the demons. There are economic demons, there are social demons, political demons. We mustn't think of these demons as mythological things. You know, we can read about them in a fairy story. It's all very nice, but you'll never meet a demon. We're meeting demons all the time, of one kind or another. We live in a world of demons. So again, I'm kind of sharing things that have impacted on me through the years that I've been practicing, or the years I've been alive. And this particular talk, I was so struck by that. I thought, it's true, we live in a world of demons. Not in a kind of horrible monstery kind of way, but just in an insidious way. The demons that masquerade as friends, the demons that masquerade as just normality, really, but actually underneath this greed, hatred and delusion, very strongly kind of present. And we live in a troubled world. You know, that was given in 1979, that's 40 years ago nearly, and I wouldn't say we're any less troubled as a world than we were then. I don't know if it's a more troubled world or if it's just that we're more aware through globalization, through media, that we live in such a polarized world. And I sometimes think if there's one demon that strides the earth at the moment, that's the demon of polarization. It's so strong. And I feel myself so involved in that demon. I polarize. You know, I can feel my own responses to things that I don't agree with. I hear people voted in a certain way, or they have certain political views, or they have certain views of anti this, that and the next thing. I polarise. I internally at least polarise with that, because I locate myself in opposition. And I believe most of that comes from fear of other, and a fear of other that is being fostered and strengthened in so many ways in our world. I'm quite a fan of Chomsky, who some of you might be fans of, and after the election where Trump became the President of the United States, you can't give a talk about demons, can you, without mentioning Trump? I'm sorry. I'm trying very hard to talk about demons without demonising. There is a difference, and anyway, Trump's there. So just after Trump's election, Chomsky wrote a piece on why he felt Trump had been elected, and he said, Trump is appealing to those who sense and experience the breakdown of society, to their deep feelings of anger, fear, frustration and hopelessness. And I think that's very true. We've done a workshop in here this morning, which some of you are here for, looking at the desire to belong and how that desire to belong can be so manipulated, and can be so manipulated by fear of other. And our belonging, rather than feeling we belong to the great and wondrous human race, we isolate and work out where we belong to feel safe and secure. And a lot of that safety and security comes from the berating or the demonising of other. So when I read that, Chomsky, I thought it's so very, very true. And I had just been in America just not long before that, and I was on my way to Venezuela, and it was quite interesting telling people in America I was going to Venezuela, where very liberal, lefty people were saying, oh my God, you don't want to go there, it's a horrible place. It's a place that can be quite scary in a way, you know. But there was something about the way they responded. It was very similar to the Sun's, don't know how many of you saw the Sun's headline about the Colombian World Cup football team, where they did a little wordplay on cocaine. And it's like, actually, I've got friends from Colombia, they're not all drug dealers, you know. But it's like, it's so easy to just manipulate that kind of thing and even get a laugh out of it. And it's like, ha ha ha, nobody really thinks X is a drug dealer. But it's still kind of perpetuating stereotypes in a particular way. I think the other thing that I can see rising out of polarisation and fear of other, which I wonder if it isn't maybe the 21st century's biggest issue and problem, is the refugee crisis. It's bloody massive, you know, it's absolutely huge. We're witnessing the highest levels of displacement on record. It's higher than during the two major world wars. It's higher than at any time in history, at least in recorded history. There are 68.5 million people forced out of their home at the moment. Just try and get your head around that. If we think about a sense of belonging, how must it feel to lose everything? And then to kind of get somewhere and be seen as somebody who's doing that because they just fancy coming to Britain to use our social services. Really? It's like it's so... One person is forcibly displaced every 2 seconds at the moment, through famine, through poverty, through war, mainly through war. And a lot of that is war about resources. So if we think climate change is not having any effect, it is having an effect. It's causing displacement for a number of reasons, social and political. Anyway, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, and I won't carry on with any more tales of woe and disaster. But my big question that comes up when we think about these things is, how do we respond to that? How do I respond to that? When I hear and I read these statistics, and I put myself into situations where I'm hearing that and I'm reading about it, I could not, but that wouldn't feel quite right either. But then what do I do when I hear those things, And I honestly believe if I'd not found the particular path that I found when I found Buddhism and the Dharma, I would not be here talking. Well, I obviously wouldn't be here talking to you because it's a Buddhafield thing. But on a more existential level, I doubt I would be here in this world. I don't think I could have stayed alive. How would I have stayed positive, really, in a way, in a world that was just so fucking crap? So having given you that lovely picture to start with, I want to look at ways we can engage, or ways that have helped me engage when I feel overwhelmed by the kind of woes and cries of the world, really. So I want to look at it under a few different headings. I want to look at it kind of personally and even psychologically, and then I want to look at it more socially or politically. And then in a way I want to look at it through the lens of the Dharma, through the lens of a Buddhist viewpoint. Because I'm trying to look at how Buddhism can support us in a world that seems to be very challenging. And I think even if we're not personally challenged in our life, and most of us here probably have relatively, I don't want to make assumptions, but most of the people that I mix with have relatively easy lives when I compare them to some of the lives of some of the people that I know who live in much more challenging conditions. So it can be very overwhelming, but I feel as a Buddhist practitioner I'm really lucky that I have ways to work with my mind directly. I can work directly with my mental states. I can work through meditation. I can work through devotional practice even, and through studying the concepts of the Dharma. I feel I'm given a little bit of a sense of a way of making sense of something which is completely nonsensical. So I've found that very, very helpful. I want to share a Wendell Berry poem. I'm aware I'm talking quite fast. It's because I've got a lot of notes. And I'm aware I'm Glaswegian. I'm very aware that I'm Glaswegian. But you're probably aware that I'm Glaswegian as well. So we talk fast. So I shall try to slow down. So a poem by Wendell Berry, which I find very moving. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and I feel free. I need that, I need, sometimes in the face of unrelenting stimuli and sensation and thought, I'm trapped in thought quite often, very sort of actively mentally active. But enough? And I'm sure most of us need those moments where we can feel peace and freedom to just help us keep going, to help keep the heart at peace. But is it enough? So again, often some of my Buddhist friends feel that there's a dichotomy between that level of contemplation and peace and quietude, kind of measured against action, measured against acting within the world. And when I'd like to say we need both. And I think all of us need both in our own lives. And I think we need both in terms of our response to the world. And, as part of a particular Buddhist community, I'd really like to see both those aspects more and more and more deepening within our own Buddhist community. Because I think they inform each other. And I think it's how we can work individually on that level is to just really acknowledge the need for that peace and quietude. And I think with that, acknowledge our fear. Just find a way of acknowledging even the overwhelm, rather than feeling we have to kind of, push it down, push it down, push it down. Have any of you seen the Book of Mormon? Isn't it good? Anyway, it's a bit crude, so don't go if you're in any way sensitive. But there's a bit in it where, do you remember the bit where they're basically, quite a few of them are gay, which is really not that popular in the Mormon religion, and they're kind of talking about pushing it down, and they do this wonderful dance where there's a whole group of boys, and a lot of them are very camp, and they're doing this dancing, pushing it down, and suddenly the lights flicker off and on, and they're all suddenly wearing pink waistcoats, and they're doing it's the same dance, same tune, same lyrics, but completely camping it up. I think that's what we need. Be willing not to clamp it down. Get out the pink waistcoats. Get out there and dance. But dance with the knowledge that there's fear there. Dance with the knowledge that sometimes we are pushing it down. Dance with the knowledge that so is everybody else, actually. Get in there and dance with each other. So we can acknowledge it without giving into it. We can even acknowledge our fear of other. It's kind of primitive brain stuff. It's not that we're horrible, nasty people because we feel a sense of discomfort or insecurity around what we don't know. But we don't need to act on it. We don't need to actually vote on the basis of it. We can kind of make sensible contributions while acknowledging that level. But is that just an individual practice that I need to go and do sitting in a meditation cushion or, wandering around somewhere in nature? No, I don't think it is. I think it's a collective and communal practice. I think we can help each other to acknowledge our overwhelm, acknowledge our fears, and kind of act beyond them. A friend of mine, a Kupa, wrote a poem called something like the Shambolic Warrior. Maybe it was actually Shambolic Warrior. I always think of it as the Shambolic Warrior. Choose whichever you like. Shambhala. Okay, I like Shambolic myself. And in that there's a couple of lines which say, "Put down the leaden burden of saving the world alone. Join with others of like mind. Align yourself with the forces of resolution. When the forces of power seek to isolate us from each other, reach out with joy." I keep thinking I'll just finish there, but actually I have got more. But reaching out with joy, it's such a beautiful kind of exhortation to each other, isn't it? So create community. Find your tribe. And it might be a tribe within a tribe. It might be a tribe that crosses lines, They're not all necessarily going to look the same or sound the same, or maybe even have the same political views. Oh my God. Just in a slightly confessional note, when I moved to England from Glasgow in 1977, I had never met a working class Tory. They didn't at that point exist in Scotland. I mean, maybe they did, but I didn't come anywhere near them. And I actually met people who were Buddhists who voted Tory. And actually I found it was my own, it was my own kind of stories and prejudice that I just assumed everybody would be exactly the same as me. And my God, they weren't. What a shock to the system. But actually some of those people have come to be amongst my strongest allies, because we've been able to break down barriers and find the things where we can communicate and connect, and the fights that we went to fight together, as it were, or the dances that we went to dance together. In 1976, in another talk given by Sangharakshita, it's a talk called Evolutionary Extinction, a Buddhist response to current world issues. He says, a consideration of current world problems makes it clear we have two alternatives. On the one hand, there's evolution, spiritual evolution, and the other alternative is extinction. This means that we, the human race, must develop spiritually, or sooner or later the human race will perish. Again, I was very struck by that and thought, what does that mean? And what does it mean to evolve spiritually? Well, it can mean all sorts of things. I think in this context it means don't just act through our given prejudices. Work out what the stories are that we're telling ourselves about ourselves and about other, and not necessarily act from that. And he gives us 4 things he suggests we can do to come into contact and kind of work with those world problems. He lists a whole load of them, all of which are still pretty relevant. And all of which are probably even more exaggerated now. He says, first of all, find a method of personal development. Because if we don't, this is me saying this, we become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We need to be working on ourselves. We need to find that quiet, peaceful place and transform the bits of ourselves that are stuck in the stories and find new and better paradigms to work from. And then he says, join a spiritual community, or if you can't find one, form one. And I think by that it means find your tribe, find the like-minded people with whom you can work, because it's so overwhelming to try and do these things on your own. And the forces of greed, hatred and delusion stalk the earth in big neon signs, In the day of the Buddha, he talks about greed, hatred and delusion. These days those forces are not only individual, they're institutionalised, and it's very hard to work against institutionalised forces on one's own. So finding a community where we can work together, the old adage, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I truly believe that. I do. I've had that experience, and sometimes what emerges when we come together in community is an emergent solution that we would never have been able to think of on our own. So an openness to being in relationship with others. And then he says, withdraw from all anti-spiritual forces, and where you can't withdraw, influence. And in a way that's what I want to talk about really for the rest of the talk. So far I've been thinking and talking a bit about the first and second of those. Find a way of working on ourselves, the transformational work, and do that with other like-minded people who can help and support us in that. But what about the other two? Withdrawing and influencing. And what we have here is more moving us into that area of the political or the social, the collective area. We need to be working in our own mental states, whatever happens. Nobody else can do that for us. They might be able to help and support us, but at the end of the day, I go to bed with my own mental states. I get up in the morning with my own mental states, and I live through that day, one day at a time, with my own mental states. But we do need to act, and not acting is action. So I think where sometimes people think, oh well, I don't really believe in politics, that's fine. But everything you do and say and buy and purchase and where you go for your holidays and how you get there, all of those things are actions, even if we think we're not acting, So I think what we can do, or what I try and do and what I'd exhort us all to do, is really work out what are the values that we want to live our life by. Find people who share those values and then actually try and bring them into relationship. So withdraw from those situations where our values that we don't want to uphold are strengthened. And I know that for myself. There are some people whose company I struggle with because they touch my own buttons, and I end up getting myself into a bit of a silo mentality and a bit of a loop. So really kind of looking at that and really trying to withdraw from those things. So in a way, living more, withdrawing doesn't mean that we ignore the world around us. I think that's the mistake sometimes can be made by people who feel they've chosen a spiritual path, is that we think that that withdrawal means that we don't have anything to do with the world. But unless you're in a cave somewhere, and even then, you're not really going to manage to live without some relationship with the world. So it's making choices about where we put our energy, making choices about what we do, living maybe more simply, really trying to challenge the paradigms that we see around us that are getting stronger and stronger. You know, really kind of trying to look at how we can influence, taking us into that other one where we can't withdraw. And you can't really withdraw from the human race, you know. So trying to really influence with the values that we feel are important, speaking out where we see things that work against our values, how we shop, how we eat, all of those choices will have an impact, not just in our pocket. I mean, unfortunately, you have to say a lot of the good choices are more expensive than the cheap choices. Don't know if anybody else has noticed that. There's a bit in Star Wars where one of the Jedis, I think it might even be Luke Skywalker, says to his master, you know, why are the forces of darkness more powerful than the forces of light? And the master says to him, they're not. They're faster, easier, and more seductive. It's so true. So true. So in a sense, withdrawing from that easy seduction and influence and trying to actually change that where we can. And creating radical alternatives, really believing that our actions will have an effect. They do. You know, creating radical alternatives. I mean, Buddhafield's fantastic. You can find a million, as I said, I'm a Buddhafield virgin, and in some ways it would not be my cup of tea. But my cup of chai, perhaps, would be better. But I really, really admire what's being done in Buddhafield, and I think the fact that you've got debates and people looking at questions that are quite deep questions is really, really important, and having fun. Seems like a great combination, really. Anyway, I want to move on to responding from a basis of Dharma practice. So I'm a Buddhist. I'm here as part of a Buddhist community, and that's been a very crucial and important part of my own path for 40 years. I was extremely young, just want you to know that, when I started. I was like 10. I wasn't actually. But when I came along to my first Buddhist class, it wasn't a meditation. I wasn't interested in meditation. That was far too woolly and navel-gazing and hippie, if I may use that term, for my liking. I really wasn't interested in meditation. But I was interested in Buddhism. I was interested in the philosophy of it all. And I kind of went along to this class, and it was a series called Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow. It was the first thing that I heard. And up until that point, I'd been quite active politically. As a quite young woman, I'd decided I was a communist, and then I moved to the left and started sort of finding ways of, you know, trying to make sense of the world. And I was one of those people that used to sell newspapers, some of you might remember them, by haranguing people, you know. Don't you care about world peace? You know? So, you know, the aggressive approach to world peace. Do you realise what you're doing? Anyway. So, and I had got rather disillusioned by that. I thought the theory was great, but actually what I was meeting were people who were just people, who had exactly the same issues as me, and a lot of them were quite misogynist, a lot of them were quite homophobic, a lot of them were quite anti this, that and the next thing. So the theory was great, but they weren't changing. And I had come to this realisation that actually I had to change and people had to change before the world could change. And I saw a poster that said, "Change your mind, change the world." Thought, sounds good. So I went along to this lecture to hear that. And I heard, it was a recording. I was going to say it was a tape lecture. It was actually on a reel-to-reel. Which some of you will think, what? Anyway, and in this, again, it was Sangharakshita, and he was talking about the need to change the world, but how you can't change the world without changing yourself. But actually it's not enough to change yourself, that the point of changing yourself is to change the world. I thought, sign me up. I'm in there. And I've never actually doubted that that is the way to go, in a sense. And it felt like I was finding an ideal in Buddhism and in the Dharma, and in particularly the way that it was being expressed in that this community at that time was an ideal which spoke to the same longing in me. It spoke to the longing for justice and for peace and for overcoming difference, but it spoke to it on a much more sublime level. But the fact was, people were also willing to do things to try and make that change. So that for me, and it's not to say that our community is the perfect community. I mean, many of you know it's not. It's like any community. It's got its history, it's got its shadow, it's got its background. We've all of us made mistakes and stumbled and picked ourselves up and gone away and come back, and etc., etc. But I really do believe that there's something about trying to work within a context of growth and trying to share that with other people, that I'm going to give the rest of my life to that. That's what I'm up for, really. I think. No, I don't. I'm absolutely sure. I'm absolutely sure. I've never wavered. I've wavered in a lot of things, and I've got angry with a lot of people in that 40 years, but I've never wavered from thinking that the Dharma could give me answers that I couldn't find in the political sphere. So the Buddha talked about greed, hatred and delusion as the three poisons that drive us into acting in ways that are less than skillful and helpful. As I say, those three poisons are still in existence. They're stronger than ever. And for me, that analysis was very helpful. It almost is a bit impersonal. It's not that I, me, you, him, it, her, them are bad people. It's like we get caught up in very stupid actions sometimes. And one of the main teachings, or perhaps the main teaching that the Buddha gave us, was to understand what he called conditionality. Well, he didn't call it that, what we currently call conditionality. He didn't speak English, I think. But what the whole law of conditionality, that everything that happens arises in dependence upon previous conditions. And as it arises, this moment of arising is part of future conditioning. So if we look at that from here and backwards, we realise that the thing that I think of as a me, a kind of somehow strong and physical, solid entity, is actually a whole series of conditionings from the past that have come together, the stories that I've been told, the stories that I've told myself, my mental responses to things, my physical responses to things, all of those things coming together have created this being that currently sits and talks to you. There is nothing in this being that is not part of a result of past. But this being, and my relationship with you at this moment, and you listening to me at this moment, is a dance which will move into the next moment. Suddenly getting an incredible string band song coming. But most of you are not old enough to know that. This moment is the only moment. But you know, this moment is a fulcrum moment, because this moment is a result of everything that's come into being now, and it's a cause for everything that comes into being in the future. And the future is only what comes into being from now. And I've lost my place. So the other side of that, if we look from here forward rather than just thinking from here backwards, is that every action that we do has consequences. So if I think of anybody, Trump, he's a result of past consequences. Somebody was saying this morning, Amaragita in her workshop was saying he's a magician. He's telling the stories at this moment that people want to hear. Some people really want to hear the stories that he's telling. Why is that? What is it that causes people to feel so dispossessed, so lonely, so unheard, that story can grip them? Whether it's Trump or anything else, anybody else, it's like that person themselves and the stories that they're telling are a result of past consequences, past actions, past stories, but they're also having a bloody great effect in the world right now. So how do we respond to that? How do we counter that, as it were? Well, all we can do really is counter from here, from where we are at this moment, and creating new conditions, really believing that every action that I do and every action that we do individually and collectively is building a world. The world is not solid. The world is made up of everything that we do and say. None of us are solid. We're made up of all those things we do and say and hear and listen to and believe. All those constructs that have brought us into this moment. And so we can also really take into account that that's having an effect into the future, that everything we do and say at this moment. I really remember, just come into my mind there, like in the 80s I worked in an organisation where we worked with people with HIV and AIDS. In the 80s that was a world which was new still, and it was often for people a harbinger of doom. If somebody was diagnosed at that point, there were no cocktails, there were no medication, there was very few resources to deal with. And so I remember sitting in a car with some people who were coming back from somewhere, and I said something like, "Oh, I hate Thatcher." Confession. I'll be probably a surprise to you that I would feel that. Anyway, this was in the 80s, and it was to do with cuts that were being made and all sorts of things that were happening. It was when there were these adverts on the telly with a great big black tombstone. Some of you remember that. And we were talking about that, and I was saying, I hate that. And this guy who was sitting next to me in the car turned around and said, "Don't hate Thatcher or hate anybody else. It just puts more hate vibes into the world." I felt really embarrassed, because I'd actually been there teaching them Metta-bhavana. Which, for those of you, if anybody doesn't know what that is, it's a meditation on loving kindness. And I'm sitting in this car 15 minutes later going, "I hate Thatcher." And this guy who was not a Buddhist and had never done the meditation in his life was just pointing something out to me, that actually the words that we use, even though I didn't really hate her, maybe, and I'd no intentions of doing it, and I wasn't planning to go down to Downing Street and assassinate her or anything like that, it's still saying that just still put something into the world, and it made me a lesser person, actually. So that was quite a lesson for me, and I really sort of took that. I mean, he was also into Louise Hay, but anyway. So greed, hatred and delusion, the three poisons, they still stalk the earth, and as I say, they've been institutionalised in so many ways. And I want to look at how in particular delusion, greed, hatred and delusion, how has delusion been institutionalised? Well, dare I say it, the media, I think, completely institutionalises delusion. The whole way that the news is given to us. And again, if I can quote Chomsky on the media, he says, "The mass media serves as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It's the function of the mass media to amuse, entertain and inform, informs in inverted commas, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs and codes of behaviour that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfil this role requires systematic and systemic propaganda." I think that's never been more true. I mean, I can quote Trump, I can quote Brexit, look at Facebook, selling all that information to Cambridge Analysis, that being used targeting, how the news, we live in a post-truth society, as we know, and all those sort of things. But actually, delusion is not a new thing. But are we going to let that institutionalized form of delusion affect us as individuals, or are we going to find ways to keep our own values alive and to keep our own values equally heard? I don't know what that means. It's a question. How do we do that? How do we get those values out there into the world? We don't have the resources of Rupert Murdoch. Well, I'm sorry, if anybody here has the resources of Rupert Murdoch, could they meet me straight after this talk? And then I'll tell you what to do with them. So, no, I don't mean it like that. I mean how to use them skillfully and, effectively. So, we live in a complex world. Let's acknowledge that it's a complex world. The conditions are complex. We are never going to know all the conditions that have brought somebody to their belief system. We're never going to know that. They go too far back. They go back into history. Personal history, cultural history, racial history. All of those things play a part in what we believe. So I started with a song. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. But the really interesting line in that is it's not just for some, but for everyone. That is so moving, actually, because it's so hard to actually feel that. Well, maybe I'm just alone in this, but I find it quite hard to feel love for everybody. I feel it really quite hard to feel love for people who don't think the same as me or act the same as me. I can stretch it a bit, but it's quite hard to really, really take seriously. So I mentioned the practice of Metabhavana. And that is what that practice is about. It's about breaking down barriers. It's about really, really breaking down what holds us separate. It's about loving not just me and my people that look and sound like me and believe like me, but actually really stretching that out. And in the workshop this morning, somebody was saying, well, what difference does it actually make if I sit here and love Trump, for example? It's not going to stop what's happening in the world. And then somebody else responded by saying, yeah, but it changes me. And in a way, that's what we can do. We can change this set of conditioning and try and really bring that into kind of relationship. It's a well-known fact, well documented, well historically observed, that it is easier to feel empathy for those that are like us than to feel empathy for others. It's kind of just how it is. Some of you probably have read Peter Singer. He's got a book called One World, Ethics of Globalization, which he wrote in the 90s, and he rewrote it in 2005 or something. So it was after 9/11 had happened in 2001. And in it he talks about this effect of being willing to give and respond to those that are like us. And he talks about, so I'm just going to read a little bit from that. So he's saying, this is 2003. This has happened, or 2002. The United Nations Children's Fund was about to issue its report for that year, called The State of the World's Children. According to the report, which was actually to be released on September the 13th, 2001, more than 10 million children under the age of 5 died every year from preventable causes: malnutrition, unsafe water, the lack of safe healthcare, basic healthcare. September the 11th, 2001 was just another day for most of the world's desperately poor people. So presumably close to 30,000 children under 5 died that day. The same day that the attacks happened on the Twin Towers. So there were 10 times the number of children died in that disaster. Okay, now obviously it was a disaster and it touched a lot of people and it triggered a lot of consequences in the world. But it's just interesting to think about that. And what happened was that through that report about child poverty and child death, it didn't lead to an avalanche of money for UNICEF. in that year, this is about America, but it's not purely to do with America. They gave about $4,000 per person towards people living in extreme poverty. However, they gave an average of £5,300 per day was given to the victims of the families, particularly of the firefighters that had gone in and been incredibly heroic. So of course we're meant to respond to that, but it is interesting, and they came from people because they were responding to something that happened in their own country, and it's so much easier to respond to that. I mean, we've seen it when the bombing in London, when there was Paris, places that are like people like us. It's so much easier to feel outrage and respond with dana, respond with generosity, when it seems to be closer to home. So what I'm saying in a way really is, we can't take it for granted that our response is a moral response. Logically a moral response would be quite different. So a lot of our response is very conditioned. So just something to kind of think about, really. And a lot of it it's taken for granted, according to Peter Singer, that national boundaries carry moral weight. It's worse to leave your fellow citizen in need than to leave someone from another country in need. That's just quite an interesting piece of information, I think. So just to finish, got another little quote from a talk called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. So again, these are talks that through the years have inspired and impacted on me. So this was given in the 80s, and I can remember going to hear this talk again at Sangharakshita, and I was in a really bad mood the day that he was given that talk. In fact, I was in a bad mood with him, but that's besides the point. But I wasn't going to go to the talk. I was like, another talk. And then I thought, well, I would. So we all went down. It was in Croydon, actually, in the Arts Centre in Croydon, and it was part of a series of talks about world issues. And Sangharakshita gave this one called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. And he said in it, peace has become a seamless garment. The world has either to wear the whole garment or go naked to destruction. There can no longer be a question of a scrap of peace to cover one part of the world's nakedness. It's impossible to think in merely geopolitical terms. We have to think in geoethical, geo-humanitarian and geo-philanthropic terms. Since peace is indivisible, the stark choice is world peace or no peace, one world or no world. And we shall achieve that only if we realise that humanity too is indivisible and act upon that realisation. We have to identify ourselves more closely with all living beings and love them with a more ardent and selfless love. We have to be a louder and clearer voice of sanity and compassion in this world. So again, for me, that was a very strong, hearing that, I just thought, all right, I'm pissed off with all sorts of things in the moment, but actually this is what I want to do. I want to help create a better world. So really trying to kind of intensify my commitment to the ethical principles that I'd found in the path that I'd chosen. But just to finish and say, metta, or that love, that indivisible love where we recognise the indivisible nature of humanity, and my love is equally strong and fervent for those with whom I don't agree. And it's not that we like them, and it's not Coca-Cola advert, or was it Pepsi, I want to teach the world to sing and perfect. It's not that. It's something much more visceral. It's an orientation of life where we're willing to move towards and relate to other and not just to what's the same. But it's not a case of me sitting here loving everybody, kind of me and my, I don't know, cloud, something or another, good Buddhist person, just sending out rays of beautiful rainbow coloured love and light to everybody. I mean, it's just as well it isn't that, because I'd be hopeless. But it is a case of finding how that orientation can affect us in our life, even in small ways, even just more kindness, bit more interest and curiosity. But it's also in a recognising that this me is only a construct anyway. It might feel solid, you know. I come over as pretty solid, Glaswegian, this, that and the next thing. Actually, all of that, it's just what I've brought with me into this moment. I don't need to take it that seriously, you know. And a lot of all the world's problems comes from the belief that I'm separate. Whether it's the ego or what David Loy calls the we-go, which is a great phrase. You know, the we-go, the we that I'm willing to identify with, the problem's everybody else. So really trying to see through that, not believe the constructions, not believe the stories that we've been told, really trying to break through that separateness and finding a way of belonging to create an inclusive and kind community in which we're not fixed in our identity and we don't fix other. I'll leave it there. Thank you.